This is a guided meditation on parenting. Take this time to breathe deeply and close your eyes. Right now, you're completely in control. Unlike the time you and your son played basketball and you attempted to slam dunk, or when you tried removing those raccoons from the basement. Concentrate on the soothing sound of my voice. Release the memory of when you wrestled with that beehive in your son's treehouse. Let go of the time you thought that skunk was a cat, or when you pulled into the garage with your son's bike on top of the car. Deep breaths. Deep breaths.
You don't have to be perfect to be a perfect parent. There are thousands of teens in foster care who don't need perfection. They need you. For more information on how you can adopt, visit adoptuskids.org. A public service announcement from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, Adopt U.S. Kids, and the Ad Council.
My skin is black.
What is the law to Black America? This is Gloria Brown Marshall, professor of constitutional law and founder of the Law and Policy Group. On February 20th at City College, 6 p.m. to 8 p.m., I will host the first radio conference discussing this question. I will be joined by leading civil rights attorneys, lawmakers, and activists. Join us in the studio audience, February 20th at 6 p.m. at City College, 160 Convent Avenue, the NAC Ballroom at 138th Street, from Dred Scott to Trayvon Martin. What is the law to Black America? That's Thursday, February 20th at 6 p.m. This is a unique Black history experience.
Hey, this is Tony Johnson, host of WHCR's newest talk show, Legalese, on Wednesdays at 4 p.m. This is your opportunity to spend an hour with an attorney and get the answers to your legal question. I'll interview lawyers from various legal fields like entertainment, bankruptcy, criminal, employment, and labor relations. To hear past shows, visit our website at www.whcr.org. That's Legalese with Tony Johnson every Wednesday from 4 to 5 p.m. on WHCR 90.3 FM, the legal voice of Harlem.
Hi, this is Flo Wiley inviting you to listen to Black Beat New York every Thursday night at 6. Black Beat New York is all about what's happening on the arts and culture scene in New York City, with a special emphasis on what's going on in the sweet village of Harlem. Celebrity interviews, ticket giveaways, Black Beat weekly events calendar, and I'll play for you some of the finest music you'll hear on the radio anywhere. Every Thursday at 6, Black Beat New York, The Flo Wiley Show.
My skin is black.
What is the law to Black America? This is Gloria Brown Marshall, professor of constitutional law and founder of the Law and Policy Group. On February 20th at City College, 6 p.m. to 8 p.m., I will host the first radio conference discussing this question. I will be joined by leading civil rights attorneys, lawmakers, and activists. Join us in the studio audience, February 20th at 6 p.m. at City College, 160 Convent Avenue, the NAC Ballroom at 138th Street, from Dred Scott to Trayvon Martin. What is the law to Black America? That's Thursday, February 20th at 6 p.m. This is a unique Black history experience.
Harlem's got its own radio station.
Once again, back is the incredible
Whcr 90.3 FM, the voice of Harlem.
Welcome to City Talk. I'm your host, President Lisa Koiko. February is Black History Month, and in the studio with us today is Dr. Cheryl Sterling. Dr. Sterling is the new director of the Black Studies program here at the City College of New York. She holds a PhD in African Languages and Literature from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She also has an MPhil in African Studies from the University of Ghana-Legon. Dr. Sterling is an author of African Roots, Brazilian Rights, Cultural and National Identity in Brazil. Among other things today, Dr. Sterling will tell us about her book and the exciting events that are going on at the Black Studies program here at City College. So, Dr. Sterling, or I'll call you Cheryl, welcome to City College and WHCR City Talk.
Well, thank you, President Lisa. I really appreciate you and the WHCR family having me here today.
We're so excited to have you, and to have you as part of the City College community and family. Tell me how you're adjusting to life at City College.
Well, I really say I'm enjoying myself here. I'm really enjoying being part of this kind of multi-ethnic, multicultural family. I think I mentioned that I've never taught so many diverse students in my entire academic career. And when I step into my classroom and, just the discussions that we have, it's amazing, it's lively, everybody's able to bring something different and new, and it just makes the teaching moment much more exciting.
Isn't that such a wonderful thing? That's one of the things I've been most struck by at City College is the different world perspectives that come together in each classroom. It's utterly amazing because you come out a changed person. You may come in with your own perspective, and then you hear other people's world views because they've lived differently with different cultural norms and different perspectives. I think that's the most wonderful part about an education at City College.
It truly is. And one of the things I'm finding too, especially because I'm an Africanist and I teach primarily about African culture, African literature, one of the things that we find out in these classes is how similar we really are. From that cultural perspectives, the things that we value, the way that people value family, the way that people value community, the different types of little rituals that we kind of take for granted, how similar the entire human experience is. So that to me is another level of validation in being here and teaching these students.
Oh, that's so wonderful. The focus of the Black Studies program at City College is on the history, the culture, the sociology, and the achievements of people of African descent around the world. Now, you've studied African studies in Ghana and West Africa. Tell us a little bit about African studies.
Well, African studies really is primarily focused on modern day and the past of Africa itself. It's not as much the African diaspora, but I expanded my studies into the African diaspora. So when people do African studies, they can do it from any field, absolutely any genre within the academic studies. You could be a political scientist, you can be a sociologist, you can be an archaeologist, you can be a literatician like I am, you could be a medical person. Mm-hmm. And you can do anything you want under the rubric of African studies. I just chose to do specifically African literature, culture, and languages because I was primarily interested in just how people related on the continent, and not just how they related on the continent, but the way that African cultures were related across the diasporas. Mm-hmm. And so for me, that was the most exciting area, just, really specialize and look at.
And do you bring that into the classroom? Do all the faculty members that teach in the program bring their own perspectives and their own fields of study into the classroom as well?
I would definitely. You have to, because I think that makes you the more passionate, engaged teacher. Mm-hmm. We all create courses that we love to teach. We all create things that are from our own expertise, and of course we all are constantly learning. you have to learn. If you don't learn, you can't teach. And so, we take things from student interest, from the overall rubric of the program, from the overall curriculum development, and we add to our own knowledge base and expand the courses in that way.
Tell me a little bit about how your expertise now is beginning to shape the Black Studies program going forward.
Well, because I'm, as I said, my area is Africa specifically, but I've expanded into the diaspora. One of the things that I've been trying to do since I've gotten here is to expand the ideas of diaspora. And, of course, the students don't even know what the term really means. And diaspora is the scattering of people. And usually, it comes from some sort of rupture. And so people automatically, when they think diaspora, they think of the transatlantic slave trade that brought people from Africa into the New World. But they very specifically, I also think of the United States, of course, and the Caribbean. And one of the things I want people to understand is that this diaspora is much larger in the transatlantic scape. When you look all over Central America, all over Latin America, there is an African diasporic population. Every country along in the Western world has received people as part of that transatlantic slavery. But there are also other diasporas that are very different in their configuration. And so one of the things I tried to do, I began a lecture series where I had people come from different parts of this kind of field of study, and they're looking at different diasporas. One particular, he studies the Afro-Arab diaspora, and started to talk about the Afro-Arab world and the reconfiguration of African identity in places like, Yemen and Saudi Arabia, and even moving into places like Iraq and Iran. And, people don't automatically assume that there's an African diaspora in these spaces, but there is. And also, one of the people that we'll have come, his name is Michael McCrane. He's going to come in April. He's coming to speak about the Afro-European diaspora. He has a book called Afro-Nordic Spaces, and he's actually half Swedish, half Trinidadian. And so he grew up in Sweden. And one of the stories that struck me when I was speaking with Michael, he used to tell me about these cross-cultural linkages, how his mother used to prepare for his dad curried reindeer.
So interesting. Well, because reindeer, you get reindeer.
You can't get curried goats, so you get reindeer. So the opening of the diaspora is that there's an African population now all over Europe. Whether they came, people came from migration, of course, migrants married and have children. And so what does that mean? What's that new configuration like? And of course, every country, because of the different cultural nuances of the country and the different languages, it also shapes those different types of migration and the people that are there. So I really want us to expand all these into these different transnational spheres. But I don't want to neglect the diaspora that we even find in our backyard. Look at Harlem.
That's right.
Harlem is an amazing community. It's an amazing community of migration from everywhere. And it's not just the African diaspora anymore. It's a diaspora from everywhere. So I want to for us to start expanding into looking at the changing face of Harlem from, the recent immigration to past immigration, to see what we can bring into our studies and see what we can expand and learn about what's going on in an urban scape at this very moment.
And that would be so wonderful because we live here in Harlem, and to understand more about the diasporas would be a fantastic thing for our students, for our faculty as well, for the community as a whole.
Yes.
And it changes so quickly, doesn't it?
It does. It really does. And, there's a point, where you're an immigrant and then your children are not. And what does that mean with that configuration of identity? Where do they place themselves? What languages are they, absorbing? To what extent are they Americanized or not Americanized? What's going on internally to the home, externally in the systems around them? How are people negotiating all of these things?
Has technology changed the pace with which these diasporas change?
I definitely think so. And one of the reasons I could even say that, when I was living in Ghana, I lived in Ghana for a big chunk of the 90s. I lived there for a good 6 years. So I was able to see the period without the internet into the internet and the ways that people could communicate and could not communicate. Now, and when I was leaving Ghana, the cell phones were still as big as my hand.
Right.
And now, you go there, you can, a cell phone is, like in your fingers, like every place else, and you can make a call to the United States by just like quickly dialing the number. The very first phone call I had to make to the States the very first trip I went there before I went to live, I had to go to the center of town and go to this telephone operator who had to call to get a foreign line in order for me to be able to call the United States. So that technology, even the ability to communicate across these borders, the fact that people are setting up classrooms, smart classrooms, and they're able to talk to people all of different continents. This would be something I would love to be able to do, have our students communicate with a bunch of students on that side of the world and kind of exchange, what's going on. Talk about the political scape. Talk about the social scape.
Great idea. That would be a fabulous idea. Mm-hmm. We have to talk about that after the show. Let's talk about that offline, because those are the kinds of things, again, we all have our imaginations about even what the person next door to us thinks or believes, and the idea of being able to bring classrooms together with students from completely different parts of the world, I think that would be phenomenal. That's an exciting idea. And the technology is there.
It's definitely there. It's definitely there. Mm-hmm.
Tell me, when you studied in Ghana, you have an MPhil. Can you tell us and tell the audience of what an MPhil is?
An MPhil is above a master's, but not quite a PhD. It's a British degree, and it's a research degree. And so, with your master's, you usually write a 40-page thesis or something like that. With an MPhil, you produce a thesis that is as large as a dissertation.
Wow.
And it's, you go through seminar work, then you go through your year of doing research, and you produce the thesis. And within the British system, it's a terminal degree. You can go teaching in university system, with that level of degree. But I also wanted to get the PhD from this side because, the MPhil is a little less recognized within the space and place.
Yeah, in the United States.
Exactly.
How did you choose Wisconsin?
Believe it or not,
it's a great school. University of Wisconsin-Madison's a great flagship campus.
Believe it or not, there are two universities that are known in this country as the Center for African Studies. University of Wisconsin-Madison and Northwestern University.
Wow.
These programs were the ones that created some of the first programs in African studies, and they have a concentration of scholars that teach all different fields in African studies. So for me, coming from Ghana to Wisconsin, the difference was the cold. But in terms of the receptivity to what I understood and what I was working with, I could find a professor in every discipline who I could go speak to, who I could engage with, who could help me in my work as I went along. And you don't find that in most places. Also, the Department of African Languages and Literature is unique in this country. It's very hard to get a terminal degree in African literature. And it's very hard to get a terminal degree in African languages. You usually have to do it through a comparative literature program or an English program, and then concentrate in that way. So this was a journey that was very direct for me. I could get exactly what I needed from the people I needed to get it from.
And I think what you're saying, if there are any students out there listening, when you're applying to a graduate program, understanding who the scholars are, who you would want as a mentor, these are such important aspects in making sure you get a PhD or a master's degree or whatever postgraduate degree you want, but getting it in a way that most suits you and is best tailored to you. And you make a really good point, because that's where you want to go. You want to go where the great scholars are, so that you have the ability to learn from them, and then you give back to them by bringing your own area of research.
Exactly. And that's what I found. And when I went to Madison, I was going there to study the Lusophone world, the Portuguese-speaking world, because at that point in time, Angola was finally coming on board, Mozambique was finally coming on board, and I thought, okay, I will do my work. I already did Anglophone Africa, so let me do my work in Lusophone Africa, Portuguese-speaking Africa. But then I started to look at so many of the similarities. It's like being back in the United States started to trigger for me what the diaspora means. And so I actually then changed my direction to Brazil because the connections were so profound. And I had been studying the Yoruba language, and Yoruba is, one of the largest ethnic groups in Nigeria. And in terms of the transatlantic slave trade, the Yoruba migration or diaspora was largest in Brazil. And you could find people there who still spoke the Yoruba language and everything, practiced the customs. So for me, it just became, okay, all right, I don't have to totally switch. I can switch, but I can continue. So that's what I decided to do, and I decided to, do some more work in Brazil and look at the African connections in Brazil as opposed to kind of going back to Lusophone Africa. But I plan to go back to Lusophone Africa. Eventually, I'll go back.
That is the beauty of being a scholar, right? You can follow those passions. Sometimes they're not straight lines, they're circuitous, and then you find the threads of connection and you bring them back in this amazing tapestry. But you have the choice of following it the way. What languages do you speak? Can you tell me?
Well, I speak Yoruba, though it hasn't been, I haven't been practicing very well. Okay, when I was in Ghana, I started to speak Tree. Okay, and then of course I speak Portuguese and I speak enough Spanish to get myself around in the Spanish-speaking world. Okay, I would love to claim some French, but not anymore.
You do really have to practice the languages, don't you?
Exactly. It's like now I'm totally lost. The languages become jumbled in my head when I try to speak French.
But did you ever find, I remember I studied French for like 7 years, but I remember once when I was in France after a couple of weeks and I was on a tour of some kind and my children were with me, and they, all of a sudden I said to them, shh, the person's speaking English, and they looked at me like I was crazy. And sometimes your brain clicks.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden my brain clicked and I realized I was hearing the person in French, but I understood what they were saying. But I don't think that could ever happen again in my lifetime. But I found it the most fascinating thing that somewhere locked in your brain is the ability so that even though you say you couldn't speak it, it would come back
at some point in time. If I was immersed in a francophone environment, it would start coming back. I just have to be immersed there. Yeah.
Oh, but that is so fun. What is the most common African language spoken? Do you know?
That's really kind of hard to say. I would say maybe Swahili, because it's a lingua franca across East Africa and across Central Africa. And it's also a very easy language to learn, comparative for Westerners. Okay. Many African languages are tonal.
Yeah, and that's
very difficult. But Swahili is a language that's built on prefixes. And so Westerners can get those concepts a little bit easier than I would say, than they can get the tonalities. But yeah, if we have a lingua franca, maybe it's Swahili at this point in time. In West Africa, maybe Hausa, but maybe Swahili a little bit more.
And Hausa is that all through West Africa?
It's through a lot of West Africa because they're traders. The Hausa people are traders, so you find pockets all over, and that's a language that people could use in the trading medium. Yeah.
Okay, so then people learn the language because of that.
Exactly.
There's a much larger spread of the language across.
Exactly.
It's always such a fascinating thing to me. Tell me about your book now. It's African Roots, Brazilian Rights, Cultural and National Identity in Brazil. There was a quote by Marshall Eakin and caught my attention. And the quote was, quote, "To be black in Brazil means to have no white ancestors and connotes social and economic exclusion rather than a racial identification," end quote. Can you elaborate on that? Tell me what that means.
This is part of what fascinated me about Brazil. Brazil is a country with a huge African descendant population. But in the history of Brazil, it's very different from the history of other African diasporas, in that there were specific, I wouldn't say, this may not be different. There are very, very specific attacks against the person because they were black. But what Brazil did in comparison to maybe the Caribbean and very much like other Latin countries, after slavery, they instituted these laws, and they were laws that were called the laws of embranquecimento. They were laws of whitening. And so basically, these laws were enacted as immigration laws to a certain extent. So they promoted immigration from white Europeans coming into Brazil. And they basically told the African descendant population that there is not much place for you in this nation.
Really?
And so you have to kind of understand the numerics of the African population even at that time. In certain places in Brazil, like the place I study, Salvador, there is maybe a 9-to-1 ratio of Africans to whites, or African descended people to the white population. Some place like Rio, it's a 4-to-1. So they saw this. So the Brazilians, Portuguese, saw themselves as losing in this race towards modernity with such a huge African population. So they quickly wanted to shift that population and boost themselves into the next, into the coming century. And so with these immigration policies, they really kind of excluded the African population in every which way possible.
Oh my.
And so on top of the exclusion, they promoted what didn't happen in the United States, which is miscegenation, intermarriage, or race mixing. And so what happens is that the African population was told, basically, you're too black to ascend, but your descendants can ascend if they whiten up.
Wow.
So these became entrenched in the psychology of the people. The laws themselves only were enacted from 1889 to 1911, but the psychology stayed. And so in Brazil, once you have a little bit of a white ancestry, you're no longer black, because everyone wanted to whiten up in order to ascend.
Wow.
And so there's a different configuration of identity. Brazilians have a term too. They have uma jota, a drop. Okay, like there's a 1-drop rule in the United States. 1 drop of black blood makes you black. 1 drop of white blood in Brazil makes you no longer black. And so they have these color gradations. They have over, I know Skip Gates has a special that he talked about Latin American and race issues, and he said it was over 100 categories, but there are actually over 200 categories of color identification. And so people will identify based on the color of their skin, the texture of their hair, the broadness of their nose, the fullness of their lips, and they have very specific categories for that. So someone would say to you, okay, you ask them about, what do they think they are? They'll say something like cor de tanjura. Okay, the cor de tanjura is the color of a black ant. Okay, so this person is usually very dark-skinned, but they have long, wavy hair. Okay, so they're not black, but they're cor de tanjura. They'll say something like chocolate, which means that they're brown in complexion, okay, but they don't want to say that they're black. They'll say things like café con leche, milk, coffee with milk, meaning they're lighter complexion, and, depending on the texture, So you get all these different self-identificatory categorizations because everyone wants to be anything but black.
I would love to pick this up after the short break. We need to take a quick break, but I'd also like to pick it up in terms of where your research is going.
Yeah.
So we'll take a break for the moment, and then we'll come back with Dr. Sterling and continue the discussion.
Take a trip to the mountain. I saw you trapped up in the cableway. I prayed that you would fall and come floating down to me. Oh yeah, you fall freestyle.
You're listening to WHCR 90.3 FM, the voice of Harlem.
Welcome back to City Talk. I'm your host, President Lisa Koiko, President of the City College of New York. I am so happy that in the studio with us today is Dr. Cheryl Sterling, Director of the Black Studies Program here at City College. For those of you who've been with us in the program thus far, We've just started talking before the break about Cheryl's book, African Roots, Brazilian Rights, Cultural and National Identity in Brazil. And Cheryl, you were talking about the whitening of Brazil and the different gradations of color and how people view themselves, and how people tried in the past not to be black, even if they had a drop of white blood. But talk about today's movement in your research today. I'm fascinated by it.
Well, my research is about the people who are deliberately choosing to identify as black, and exactly how, not only how do they identify as black, but how they configure Africa in their identity. And so my research is much more recent, it's much more current, it's in the last 20 years of these movements. And it really started, I think, one of the protagonists in this, his name is Abdias Nascimento. And he's a huge scholar of you could say, negritude in some ways, blackness in Brazil, but negritude not as in the negritude movement that we know from Francophone Africa, but just the sense of inculcation in people, a sense of a larger identity. And so what we see in the last 20 years are really heavy-duty political movements where people are saying, okay, we can't afford to keep this kind of disenfranchised identity. We can't, because it's keeping us apart. It's keeping us from gaining any political power. It's keeping us from kind of moving forward. And we have to start moving forward in this nation. And so part of the political structure came with a group called the Movimento Unificado, the Black Movement. And so they began a series of different postures and positionings all across the country to kind of push the idea of a black identity. And you see this education across all boards, but mostly my work concentrates on literature and literary movements and cultural movements. And in these literary movements and the cultural movements, Africa becomes a central focus because, of course, Africa is the birthplace. Mm-hmm. And so people start revisioning what their idea of blackness is, because in the dominant narrative, blackness is outsiderness. Blackness is in some ways still primitivity. It's a way for you not to be a part of the nation. Their vision is that we are part of the fabric of this nation. We came here, from the 1600s. We helped build this country. Everything that is part of this country that people call culture really is African in its roots. And we need to acknowledge that we as African people contributed equally to the development of Brazil as everybody else in this whole structure. And so it's a deliberate inculcation of not just pride in being African, but definitions of what Africa is. So for me, what's fascinating is how they create what Africa is. And they create it very much in religious culture, in spiritual culture, and in just like in everyday ordinary life. So,
give me some examples. No, I'm very interested in understanding how that is and how it's gaining traction.
Well, one of the areas in which I looked at the way they're representing African culture is in the religious structure of candomblé. And candomblé is the Afro-Brazilian recreation of African religions. And so this candomblé I specifically look at very much derives from the Yoruba world in West Africa, in Nigeria. And so the Yoruba have a specific structure of belief. They believe that there is one God. Many people don't understand this about African cultures too, and African peoples, that many of the African cultures really are very monotheistic in their outlook. But they believe that God is very divorced from human beings. And so God doesn't interact with human beings. God isn't a he, God isn't a she. God is it. Right. Okay, and it's you can't even say God is a spirit. God is the vastness of the universe. And because God is the vastness of the universe, we human beings cannot understand God because we are not vast in that way. We understand and apprehend things in our limited way. So what God has done in God's infinite wisdom is to create ways for us to understand the way the universe works. So God is infused everything with divine force. So it's monotheistic and also maybe pantheistic in that everything has a bit of divinity in it.
So rocks, the soil,
everything,
really...
the ocean, the wind, everything. You know, in another culture, the Akans in Ghana, I was telling this to my class, they say there's a saying that they have. They say, if you want to speak to God, you speak to the winds. Okay, because it's everywhere. So what happens in understanding that these kind of like pantheistic manifestations occur, these pantheistic manifestations, people on this side of the world have named them spirits or deities and so on and so forth. And they've anthropomorphized them. They've given them human qualities. They've given them gender, they've given them certain representations that we can understand. So one of, like a big, huge spiritual force is the ocean. Of course, because it moved, brought people. And the ocean is envisioned as the bringer of life, the mother of life. And so within the Yoruba pantheon in West Africa, this is what Yemen called Yemanja, also in Brazil, Yemanja. Okay, and so to see the manifestations and how they practice and they envelop this tradition and how they it's not quite worship, it's venerate this spiritual force. That's what I'm looking at. So Yemanja in Brazil is considered the mother of all life. She is usually, if you're going to give a physical depiction of her, she's usually depicted as a woman with like a mermaid, because, coming out of the ocean. She's usually dressed in blue or in white because of the color of the ocean. She is, because she's a female, she has, beautiful jewelry. When you give her, if you want to talk to her, you talk to her about things that deal with life, that, she's considered the mother. Since she's the mother of all, she takes care of all children. And so, you go to her when you want children, you want to help take care of your children, you want to take care of yourself. You go and you sit by the ocean and you talk to her. You give her things in terms of gifts that women love. You would give her, like fruits and cakes, and you give her flowers and perfume. And, even like the fruits are invested with fertility. Okay. Like maybe you give her a watermelon because that's a symbol of fertility in so many ways. And so kind of the ways in which the Yoruba practice this religious belief, and what they do with Yemanja is one way, and then the way that Afro-Brazilians, practice this and the rituals they have for her is another way. But what I'm interested in is how they all connect. The fact that this entity still lives.
Do they also end up integrating with Christian beliefs and other types of religions?
Brazil is extremely Catholic, we all know. And so, say for instance, February 2nd of every year is a day set aside to venerate Yemanja. Okay? And so this February 2nd also corresponds with the Catholic calendar. And so there are huge processions on the streets, and she is the Virgin. She's conceived of as the Virgin. Okay. So you will see both depictions of her. You'll see her as the spiritual force coming from Africa, and also you'll see depictions of the Virgin. Wow. Okay. And so both are in tandem, and it's a juxtaposition. It's not really taking away from one or the other. It's really a juxtaposition. And the same ideas. This is the mother figure. This is the mother figure of mercy in so many ways. But the other side of Yemanja, because she's the ocean, she can be very terrible. And that may not be as much in the Mary figure, but there's an acknowledgement that because the ocean can give life and the ocean can take life away. So you have to be very careful in how you address her and what you do with her and how you interact in the world if you are a child of her. They also believe that every person is born with one of these deities, which are called orishas. Okay, so everybody is born with an orisha. And so you come in, and this Orisha is guiding you and protecting you and kind of showing you the way, helping you with your path in life.
Is it the equivalent of what would be called in the Catholic faith a guardian angel?
Exactly. Exactly.
And do they have certain characteristics?
All of them. They all have different characteristics. Like, again, Yemanja is the mother figure.
Right.
She has a sister, Oshun. And Oshun is also a mother figure, but she's also more a figure not only of motherhood, but of femininity and beauty. So she also depicts, can be very capricious in so many ways. So you approach her a little bit different than Yemanja. You may give her some of the same things, you may talk to her in some of the same things, but this is the beautiful woman who can do anything that she wants in the world. So it's not just, oh, mother, please help me. It's like you have to acknowledge that you're dealing with, maybe a little bit more. Exactly. Right. So these, these things are kind of understood. But what also, there's, of course, the male pantheon, and you find that more warrior orishas survive. Like the Ogun is the Orisha of war. Right. And so he survived. Another Orisha, Shango, is the Orisha of fire. Okay, he also survived, and he's hugely venerated. And so these two, they also have their specific personalities.
So what's interesting to me, how about the Orishas that did not survive? Are there any that didn't survive, and have you done any research to understand why some things fade out and other things remain?
Well, one of the things, too, with Brazil, the people from especially the Yoruba world came the latest in the slave trade. Okay. And they came in the late 1700s into the early 1800s. And slavery in Brazil lasted the longest in the Western world. It lasted until 1888.
Really?
And so they came in such huge numbers. They were actually, one of the reasons their language survives is because when they came in such huge numbers, the Yoruba language in the city of Salvador, and Salvador is in Bahia, the Yoruba language became a lingua franca. So it usurped Portuguese.
Really?
And so this pantheon kind of dominated, and people started to identify as Yoruba in so many ways. But they also came from more specific areas in the Yoruba territory, because the Yoruba territory is vast. Mm-hmm. And so they came from certain areas, and so the areas in which the more dominant people came, those are the Orishas that survived more, you say, than some of the others. But one in particular, I was very fascinated. There's an Orisha that is well known in Yoruba land. It's the Orisha Oko, and this is the Orisha of farming. And this Orisha does not survive in Brazil. And I was like, okay, well, this is when you want good crops and everything, you go to this Orisha, you talk to the Orisha and everything. And I was like, well, if you're an enslaved person and you're working on a plantation, that's true. Is that what you're going to ask for? Good crops? No, so the ones that do survive are the ones that kind of inspired resistance or inspired them to keep going, as opposed to keep working, in those ways that they were supposed to work in.
Yeah, that makes such sense. Mm-hmm. But you don't think about it until you spend some time and you take a little bit of a distance from it, don't
Exactly.
Mm-hmm. What did you like most, or what do you like most about studying Brazil?
Brazil is ever fascinating to me. In fact, I had a scholar come in just recently to speak about Brazil, and she spoke about the quilombos. And the quilombos were the maroon communities, the communities of escaped slaves in Brazil. And again, these are very configured slightly differently from what we normally expect. Because, there's a heroic narrative of these escaped, these colonies of escaped slaves in the Caribbean and even here. And so one of the things that she pointed out with these quilombos is that, of course, they weren't just African peoples in these quilombos. They were everybody. So Portuguese lived there, the indigenous people lived there, so they lived, in tandem in these spaces. So it was because again, maroon communities are where the Africans who rebelled stayed, and they stayed separate. So the fact that they were integrated in. And then some of these quilombos, they were very close to the slave plantations. So they were close to their slave masters. And the slave masters knew that their slaves were in these quilombos, in the specific area that she studied. So slavery was here and they were right next door, but nothing was done. And so kind of like, how was this negotiated? What was going on during that period of time?
Is there any documentation about?
There are tons of documentation, but the thing is, you have to start studying Portuguese and be willing to spend time living in Brazil and going into the archives and everything. And so it's like everything that we know about what we think we know about the history of slavery, what we think about today in the black movements all around, are different. It's just very different when you look at Brazil. There's a different level of articulation and understanding, and that's fascinating.
Has the black movement in Brazil gained a lot of traction? Has there been a change in political power structure at all?
They finally gained traction in that there are a couple of laws that were passed recently. One of them, and people are still a little jaundiced about this, was an affirmative action law. And so this affirmative action law, or I should say, was a law of quotas, was to help bring in a population of more African descended people into the university systems, because there's such a disjuncture in education, and that's where you see a lot of the discrimination. You see it in the economics. If you walk on the streets, you can't quite see it, because everyone is friendly, everyone gets along, everyone is sociable, but you see it when you start looking at the economics and the educational arrangements. But one of the things with this idea of the quotas is that really everybody in Brazil has some African descent. So then suddenly people start claiming African descent to get into universities, whereas before they wouldn't claim it. So it's still, it's a little, problematic to a certain extent. Yeah. But this was ratified also by the Brazilian government, by the Congress and the Senate. And this was the first time across the board that the government acknowledged that there was a huge issue of race in the country. And so there are pockets of identifying this, but for the entire government to ratify this, they saw this as a huge victory.
So everything in steps.
Exactly.
But as you know, which is true, because you can see it even here at City College, education is the great equalizer. And you really need to have a fair education system.
Exactly. And Brazilian education, even for the people who are the wealthiest, is not very good.
Really?
People leave the country. They're very wealthy, put their children in international schools, and they tend to leave the country. So the educational system there is really quite poor. And so when you are the poorest of the poor in that educational system, you're coming out very, really miseducated.
Right. Oh. Very, very interesting. Let's switch gears, but thank you for talking about your book. It's very exciting, and your research is exciting, and I'm sure you'll have graduate students from City College also working with you on that, or at least I hope you will.
Well, I'm getting a few students, so that's very nice. That's very, very nice.
I'm going to switch gears back to City College. Can you tell me and talk about what your plans for the Black Studies program are?
Well, one of the things, we've already started it, in terms of bringing in, starting a whole lecture series.
Good.
In which we're bringing in scholars from around the country. And I really would like to appeal to people across the CUNY system, because I know that there are people who are doing amazing research, and we'd love to be a resource for them, So right now we're doing a talk monthly, but I would love to expand it to do maybe a weekly brown bag where people can come in and kind of showcase what they're doing, and really kind of expand the intellectual environment, so we could talk about all these different issues that, and just give a voice to this in certain ways. We also, one of the things, because of my different worlds, I was just, wherever I go, there's always a demarcation. African students are African students, Caribbean students are Caribbean students, African American students are African American students. And one of the things that I tried to do was to call the students together, and so have a meeting with them, in which I asked the leaders of all of these different organizations to come together and to let's see what we can do with the Black Studies program to be more of a center voice for them and to help bring them together. And so, those two immediate things to me, to get the student population to begin to understand that we're not so separate, that we have some rubrics in which we can talk and overlap, and and we can kind of move together. And I saw this with this Black History Month, because the students did take that call seriously, and they in fact created an event that is, I know we'll talk about the events, but they created the first Pan-African cultural show, in which these organizations have come together. They're bringing in people performing in the college and outside of the college, performance poets. They're having a fashion show. But it's not just a fashion show. They want to show their cultural colors.
Oh.
And so, kind of like, so this is the beginning, and, I'm trying to get them to understand, and I'm going to work harder and harder at this, to understand that we really need to be a more unified group in so many ways, and then we can help build the program as we go along.
That's really very important. But as you said, the cultural diasporas are very different.
Yes.
And so looking for those unity areas where there's commonality.
Exactly.
And then you learn from each other as well. That's very exciting. Tell me about what we're doing for Black History Month, because you have many, many plans. The calendar is packed.
The calendar is packed, and yes, I have worked with the students to put the calendar together.
That's
and
terrific.
they've done an amazing job. I have to speak about tonight. Tonight we have an art gallery opening, and so it was planned for last week Monday, but unfortunately our snow took us out of the running for that. And so we have a gallery opening with in tandem with the Cohen Library Archives. It's going to be on the 5th floor in the NAC building.
Great.
And we have these artists that are kind of prominent around New York, prominent internationally. And this part of the gallery opening, they're called Renaissance artists. And the reason why they're called Renaissance artists, because they're not just artists in terms of the visual medium, they also do another medium. And so we have featured tonight, we'll have a gallery talk by Jacqueline Bishop. She's a painter who writes, and so she's a poet and a storyteller, okay? Dick Griffin, who is a painter and a musician, and also Gilbert Fletcher, who is a painter, and he's a painter of writers, of all people. And the last person was Ramona Candy, and she's a painter and a dancer. So kind of like bringing all these kind of different media together in terms of this whole gallery production. Every Tuesday, we will have a film, and this is done in coordination with the BMI, with RAPSI, and we're doing the Blaxploitation series. So Tuesday between 12 to 2, we have a film, and it's in the Lippman Conference Room in this NAC building, and it's open to the public. The next one on the 11th will be Watermelon Man.
Oh, gosh. Oh, my.
Yeah, I think, the first one that was done was Cotton Comes to Harlem. So, I know everyone missed that, but it was really well attended. And after that, we'll have Claudine and Friday Foster. So I think it'll be an exciting lineup for people.
Do you do a discussion after the film, a panel discussion after the film?
There's a little discussion, and so as long as there's time, because because we're wedged between classes, so that's programmed into the time, but at least 15 minutes of that.
That's good.
So our big event, we have a couple of big events. One is with our keynote speaker, Daniel Black, and his talk is entitled "You Owe Because You Live." And Daniel Black is an amazing author. He's, written at least 4 different novels, The Perfect Peace, They Tell Me of a Home, The Sacred Place, 12 Gates to the City. This is the choice of the students. I spoke to them, and I asked them, who do you want to come and speak? And he was overwhelmingly their choice. They've read at least one of his books, and so we're really looking forward to that. He's also the creator of a ceremony that takes place here called the Ndugu Nzinga ceremony. It's a rites of passage ceremony. And so I'm hoping he'll talk about kind of like the impetus in creating this and what that means for the students to go through that kind of ceremony in order to reconfigure their sense of identity, their sense of culture, who they are in the space and the place. So I found that a lot of the student leaders have gone through the ceremony.
Really?
So I'm really fascinated to see, what he has to say.
Have you been part of the ceremony? Or,
no, since I just came, unfortunately, I was invited to the ceremony when I came, but I had another talk that I was giving on that day. So next year, definitely. It takes place every September.
Really?
So I'm really looking forward to, to the whole event again. Yeah.
Wonderful.
And of course, on the 20th, we have our radio station broadcast. That's titled From Dred Scott to Trayvon Martin, What is Law in Black America? And from what I understand, we're going to have a really great group of panelists who will talk about the different types of legal, well, not just legal systems, but the different laws that are applying to young people in this country and what you can do to protect yourselves, across the board. And the moderator is Gloria J. Brown Marshall, who is an associate professor of constitutional law at John Jay. So
that sounds like a very, very interesting and very important and timely topic.
I think so. And, there's been a whole lot of stuff about, different injustices, and the Trayvon Martin case, of course, has gotten so much attention. So I think this will help pull people in.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that these are the kinds of things that we should be doing more and more of at City College.
I would definitely agree with you. And I think that, we have a population of students that are really ready.
They are.
They really are. They're really ready. They're politically motivated. They're interested. And they need a voice. And, well, they need a space for a voice. They have the voice, the space for the voice, and, kind of advocates in order to kind of get that voice heard.
Well, I cannot thank you enough. This has been a fantastic show. I truly appreciate you coming. Dr. Sterling, I'm also so grateful that you accepted a position on faculty here at City College. I can already see the transformation and the exciting things going on. I look forward to seeing what goes on and how the plans unfold for Black Studies. And thank you again, and thank you all for listening to City Talk. Again, the show is produced by Angela Harden, the general manager of WHCR, and as always, our board operator, Tina Dixon. Thank you, Tina, production manager here at WHCR. Again, I'm your host, President Lisa Cuoco. Thank you for tuning in, and I look forward to speaking with you again next month. Please come to the events. The events are open to the community, and there are fantastic events. And can you just give us once more where the calendar can be found so that people can get on and find the calendar?
You can come to the website, ccnycuny.edu/Black Studies. Look under the events page. Everything is listed under the events page. And we have been sending this calendar out to the newspapers and across the different CUNY broadcast lists.
Okay, so thank you again. Have a wonderful day, and let's hopefully not too much more snow. Bye.
WHCR 90.3 FM, New York.
Got a thing that's based on a kind of Latin rhythm known as the bossa nova, but it is not really a bossa nova. But we think that you will dig this because this is the bossa nova. Not really a bossa nova, but we got a thing that's based on a kind of Latin rhythm known as the bossa nova.
You're listening to WHCR 90.3 FM, the voice of Harlem.
My skin is black.
What is the law to Black America? This is Gloria Brown Marshall, professor of constitutional law and founder of the Law and Policy Group. On February 20th at City College, 6 p.m. to 8 p.m., I will host the first radio conference discussing this question. I will be joined by leading civil rights attorneys, lawmakers, and activists. Join us in the studio audience, February 20th at 6 p.m. at City College, 160 Convent Avenue, the NAC Ballroom at 138th Street, from Dred Scott to Trayvon Martin. What is the law to Black America? That's Thursday, February 20th at 6 p.m. This is a unique Black history experience.